Our speakers are arriving in just a couple of minutes, so do bear with us for a delayed start. You can hear? You can't hear me speak. Okay, I think there's a sound issue then if our audience can't hear us. Okay, that's great. Yeah, thank you. Could I ask those who were sat on the end to sort of come a bit more into the, it's nicer for the panelists if we can see you. If you can come a bit more into the middle, that would be wonderful. We'll have to huddle up a little bit. Yeah. Oh no, don't close the door. Help get people in. Hey, we have speakers. Wonderful. It's okay. Don't worry. We've delayed the start until you could all arrive. So microphones are on at these next 3 seats, or wherever you'd like to sit. Yeah, that's perfect. Masamba, would you like to come up? And then it's just Zach, who is, I think, coming through any moment. Wherever you would like. Wherever you would like. Exactly. I feel there's 4 of us, so we can all fit in there. So just because we've had a delayed start, so I'll cut one of the questions so we can get to the key messages more quickly. And it's just Zach we're missing. What I might do for the sake of time is suggest that we get started in 2 minutes, and then Zach can just join us in a couple of minutes. So Sylvia, we'll start in 2 minutes. Thank you. It does feel like a bit of a gym workout getting to different events. Oh, I see. See, there's a mistake. Speakers should always travel in packs. You've separated from the pack, and now we're missing a standards expert. It's not helpful when we're doing an event on standards. it's all right. It's all good fun at COP. It wouldn't be COP if we weren't lost or late. Brilliant. Okay, we'll give it one more minute and then we can get going. I feel very powerful, everyone. I have a clicker. I don't normally get handed a clicker, so I'll be enjoying taking you through that. Okay, I propose we begin. So Sylvia, when you're ready, we'll begin now. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to those of us in the room who've joined us here in Dubai, and to all of you online. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are joining us from in the world. My name is Emily Faint. I am the Net Zero Policy Manager at the British Standards Institution, or BSI, as you may know us. And I am joined by a phenomenal panel. And today we are here to talk about a conversation that actually should be further at the top of our minds than it normally is, but is going to, I think, lead us to some really impactful insights and takeaways today, which is the topic of using standards to drive transformative innovation. Standards are often thought as an instrument that follows behind innovation, that those who innovate, who lead the market, do so, and then standards come behind to reflect what that market consensus is. And there's a great deal of evidence to show that that's true. But research conducted by BSI earlier this year that was published with Dr. Blind showed that actually standards are an underutilized tool to drive transformative innovation. I.e. the innovation that is needed to actually achieve huge systemic transformation, such as reaching net zero, which is a key topic that we are all here to talk about today at COP28. So the research found that actually ambitious standards, or something that we can call impossible standards, can be used to drive mass market innovation. And it operates by setting a threshold beyond which the market is currently at. So for example, I'm sure many of us here have heard about the fact that net zero is a complex journey for many organizations to achieve, and that it would be difficult to set standards that achieve net zero, but also reflect where market feasibility is. What we've seen is with deliverables like the ISO net zero guidelines, setting the threshold for the market to meet, rather than reflecting where the market is at, can actually drive innovation at a much quicker pace. The next key insight that the research found is that around ambition and the ambitious guidance and support of major intergovernmental organizations, such as those of the UNFCCC and other intergovernmental organizations. The third insight was that actually driving greater inclusion and diversity of participation into standardization yields much more ambitious and high integrity outcomes. Again, we saw this with the development of the ISO net zero guidelines last year, which had a 75% level of participation of those who had never participated in the standards process before, and has been found to be one of the highest integrity tools on the market, in alignment with the UN Secretary General's Integrity Matters report last year. And finally, and this is a really key one, writing standards and developing standards for the market is not enough. Just as much impact is generated through the engagement to drive the dissemination of a standard as of writing it, which is a really key message for those who work in standardization to take away and realize it is not enough just to develop a standard and publish it. You also need to be taking a more proactive approach to drive the uptake and understanding of the standards that you produce. And this is how we can find much greater regulatory alignment to develop the enabling policy and regulatory framework that businesses need to actually take net zero action. So with these insights in mind, I'm very pleased to introduce our panel. We have the wonderful Masambul Tuyoy from the UNFCCC's Global Innovation Hub, who has very kindly given us this excellent venue today. We have Zakia Kassam, who is the new chair of the ISO Environmental Management Technical Committee, which, if you don't know, is one of the most important committees in the whole of the international standard system, because it addresses all of the key standards on climate change management and environmental management. And last but not least, we have the wonderful Violeta González-Bejar, who is the advisor to the Deputy Director General from the World Trade Organization. So thank you, the three of you, for being here, and I'm really excited to get into this discussion with you. So the first question I want to direct to you, Masamba, and to you, Zach, which is, how can impossible standards help us to drive innovation for net zero? And as a reminder to the audience, when we say impossible standards, we mean those that set a higher threshold than where the market actually is. How can we use these thresholds of innovation, of integrity, to drive greater action? I'll pass to you first, Masamba.
Well, thank you, Emily, and good afternoon to all of you. Very pleased to be in this very important panel with a very important topic focusing on impossible standard. At the Global Innovation Hub, we have some key approach to solution. What we are saying is whenever we are working on supporting the development of solution, we need to ensure that we are doing the right thing, and we need to ensure that we are doing it rightly. What do we mean by we are doing the right things? It actually is articulated around a keyword, needs. We need to ensure that when we are setting goal and target, we set the goal and the target not based on our perception of what is possible, but based on what is needed. And the gap between what is needed and what is actually possible is the key driver for innovation. We need also, when we are using innovation, to apply it to the needs, not to the means that are used to satisfy the needs. This is a very important point. And I will come back to that one because I think we will need even to slightly redefine what is meant by impossible standard, because this second aspect is critical. When we are using innovation, we need first to apply it to the needs first, and then to the means that are used to satisfy the need. And then the third element is that innovation should be demand-driven. We should move away from the current framework where we have product push innovation, where you develop your product first and then you look for use case. It should be the other way around. The demand, the needs should be what drive innovation and not the other way around.
Absolutely.
Now, just coming back to this aspect related to the definition of impossible standard, I wouldn't say that impossible standard are standard with benchmarks that are more ambitious than what we are capable of. Because it's not about capability at all. When we are, in my mind, when we are talking about impossible standard, we do not focus on capability. Because if you say it's better than what we are capable of doing, we are still at the sectoral level. And it's still about incremental change. What we need to do is that the impossible standard should not focus on the means. They should focus on the needs. Now, very often what happens is that the needs are much more ambitious than what we have currently available. But very important, it's not about capability, but it's about needs.
Thank you.
And it's why we are focusing on the core human needs. That it's extremely different, because this is only when you focus on the need that you can expand the space for innovation and come up with the most transformative type of innovation. Like instead of moving from combustion car to electric vehicle, you use space digital technology to for land use planning and site selection, so that you can disrupt motorized transportation.
Thank you, Masamba. I think those are some really key points here. So focusing on what is needed to meet actual core human needs, not on the perception of what is possible, which I think is so pertinent to the discussion of net zero and standards. And so coming to you, Zach, in your new role as chair of the ISO Environmental Management Committee, how do you see the role of standards in driving innovation towards net zero, and particularly with those comments from Masamba in mind of actually setting the threshold for what is needed rather than just where the market currently is?
Thanks, Emily. I agree with my colleague, and I think what I would emphasize is when you set those ambitions at a level that is needed, and what I love about the net zero guidelines is it forces planning for interim targets as well as long-term targets. And in that process, it also defines what your capital programming needs to be. So there's going to be a point where you push efficiency as far as you can, and then you have to make a technology switch. And because you need to get to net zero, that technology switch takes capital planning, and you actually need to invest dollars into it. So there's going to be limits on technologies like an internal combustion engine, and where the innovation comes in is when you realize that in order to actually hit net zero, I need to look at different alternatives. The innovation comes in the process of taking a look at alternatives and doing the capital planning that comes with that.
Absolutely, yeah. So again, that real in practice, in action example of where an approach of principles-based and criteria-based rather than technology and feasibility where it is actually driving innovation to reach thresholds at a much faster rate than what was believed as possible. And actually, we can already see this in action with the application of the ISO net zero guidelines. For those of you who haven't seen, some major case studies were published this week from major companies such as General Motors, showing how in less than a year of applying the ISO net zero guidelines, they've been able to make key changes that they had not previously recognized needed to be made now. And by driving a greater emphasis on what is possible now, we can drive much faster innovation in all kinds of organizations, but in particular in major emitters. So really key points there. So I'm going to move next to you, Violetta, from the WTO perspective, because many people watching this may not know that recognized international standards have a really unique role in preventing technical barriers to trade. It's not something we can do without for the global economy to flourish. But equally, to balance these needs for transformative innovation, focusing on core human needs that Masamba has outlined, I'd be interested in your thoughts. How can intergovernmental organizations like the World Trade Organization work better with standards bodies to harmonize this fragmented landscape of net zero best practice?
Thank you, Emily, and thanks for inviting me to join this panel. I first have to apologize. I lost my voice on Trade Day, which was
That's what COP is all about.
the 4th of December. And maybe just to quickly say, the WTO is the only global international organization that sets rules for nations to trade. And the reason why we're here at COP is really to build more collaboration between the trade and climate communities. And I feel that standards are really at the heart of that collaboration, that nexus between trade and climate. And to answer your question, Emily, what we've been seeing, especially in high energy intensive sectors that are trying to reach either net zero or near zero, is that there's a growing proliferation of voluntary and private standards. And for us at the WTO, our technical barriers to trade agreement that was established, I think, in 1994, 1995, really called for our members, so our governments, to follow international standards as much as possible. And the reason was because they can then choose to have their national regulations adopt international standards, and that eventually can help to be able to build more alignment of standards and reduce technical barriers to trade. So what we're seeing in the space of decarbonization in many countries and companies that are trying to reach more ambitious goals is that growing proliferation of standards can really put additional increased costs for compliance, additional increased costs for measurement of carbon emissions in products and in technologies, and that eventually could make it harder for companies to move to establishing net zero goals. I'll just share an example of maybe innovation, since we are, after all, in the Global Innovation Hub, is work that the WTO and other international partners like the International Energy Agency, UNIDO, and the Breakthrough Agenda, we've joined forces in the last year to bring the steel sector together. The steel sector contributes to around 8% of global carbon emissions, and they're under a lot of pressure to decarbonize. We've managed to get 42 international standard-setting bodies, not international, standard-setting bodies, industry associations, companies, and international organizations to basically commit to the steel standards principles, which are essentially, it's a set of principles that's really trying to bring the international community to agree on how to work towards common emission measurements methodologies to accelerate the transition to near zero, sorry. And what the principles really call for is essentially to get more dialogue, more constructive collaboration between standard-setting bodies. ISO is one of the endorsing organizations.
As is BSI, I should mention.
And BSI as well, to work together. And for us, it's been a very interesting exercise. It's not something that us at the WTO Secretariat have been involved in doing so before, and so we're really proud to really think about being innovative and being able to support our partners and using our convening power essentially to bring everyone together. So it's been a very successful exercise.
And that's really interesting, and I'll bring you in on this and Masamba in a moment from the UNFCCC's perspective, because that's really the key thing here. The WTO has never done something like that before, but has, for such urgent needs like decarbonisation, in particular of hard-to-abate sectors like steel, the WTO has made a decision to step in to help drive this convergence, and now we're seeing the launch of the Green Steel Principles. Is this something that you think can be applied to other high-priority areas such as net zero itself?
Absolutely, and I mean, we're seeing an increase not from our members yet, so from our governments, but really from many partners that are working either in hydrogen or cement that are coming to us to see if we can help with our international organization partners just bring communities together. So we're exploring also, thinking of steel as a pilot, but eventually maybe moving into other sectors.
See, and this is the exciting story here that I think the research published by BSI really brings to life is, again, actually, if intergovernmental organizations like the World Trade Organizations and indeed like the UNFCCC can actually use their convening power and their global convergence to push these innovations faster, we can get them to market that much more quickly and these emissions actually start to reduce. Masamba, I'd love your thoughts on the role of the UNFCCC in bringing together this fragmented global landscape to drive innovation and harmonization. And in particular, I'm conscious of the UN Secretary General's call for greater integrity through the Integrity Matters report, seeing the recommendations from that report be captured in the ISO Net Zero guidelines, and indeed further initiatives such as the UNFCCC's recognition and accountability framework. There's a huge amount going on there. What role do you see the UNFCCC playing in working with standards bodies to drive this transformative innovation on net zero?
I would like, before I respond to that question, to further highlight one aspect in my view is extremely important for the definition of impossible standard. I think we need also to differentiate impossible standard with principled standard. My understanding of principled standard is that they are standard with requirements that are loose, and these requirements are linked to what the product is. So what is it that it is made of? My understanding of an impossible standard is a standard with requirements that are objective, accurate, but on what the product should be used for. That's the main difference in my view. In the first case, you focus on what the product is, and this is why, for innovation, if the product does not exist, you are not able to say what the product is. But you can define what the product will be used for. And this, you can define it in a very objective manner and in a very accurate manner. This distinction is very important because principal standard, they have positive aspect and negative aspect. Because the requirements are loose, they are subjective and very difficult to assess because they are subject to interpretation. Whereas if you have an impossible standard, the requirements are actually very objective and accurate, but they focus on what the product should be used for. In both cases, you open up the space for innovation, but differently. When you are focusing on principal standard, you have alternative way to comply. But when you are focusing on impossible standard, you can actually come up with new innovative way of satisfying the need.
Absolutely.
I think that's a very important distinction between the two. It's why I wanted to come back on that. Now, on the need to bring together the different stakeholders and work with them. So we have to work with the stakeholder on two things. One is we need to be able to assess compliance, and this is what our colleagues that are dealing with all the issue related to implementation of the 2020, the net zero guideline are dealing with. But the other aspect that is, in my view, also extremely important, which is not about compliance, but is about facilitation. Stakeholders we need to have a structure that ensures, let's say, when there is a claim, the claim is in compliance with a standard and guideline that exist, but we need also to have a structure that can facilitate stakeholders so that they can achieve the net zero target. And
Absolutely.
This structure for facilitation is the UN Climate Change Global Innovation Hub, and we are looking forward to continue to collaborate with the stakeholder, including ISO, and in this UN Climate Change Global Innovation Hub.
And that, thank you so much, Ms. Sambora. And actually, so the role of the UNFCCC is to drive that convening power and to bring together all these different stakeholders, which is why, again, with its support, we find that the ISO Net Zero Guidelines output does meet that high integrity threshold set by the UN Secretary General's Integrity Matters report. So how can we make this happen more often, and how can we make this the norm? That leads me on nicely to the next question around how can we drive increased and diverse inclusion in standards to make sure that we are continuing to more consistently generate these high ambition, inclusive and applicable standards. And I'm interested in coming at this question from two angles. One, from the angle that you would imagine, which is how can we make sure we can improve on our capacity building and bring more voices in, particularly from lower income regions who are not as prominently featured in the development of international standards. But also from the perspective that you've highlighted, Violetta, from the regulatory alignment perspective, how can we make sure that we're getting more policymakers and regulators themselves engaged in standards development, as they are also key users of the standards and the criteria they set out? So I'd love to come to you first, Zach, from the increased participation in standards development, particularly from lower income regions, and then to you, Violetta, afterwards on engagement from policymakers and regulators. So I'll start with you, Zach.
So ISO had released a 2030 strategy, which our technical committee, the environmental committee, mirrored that. And a key component of the 2030 strategy was all voices heard. So we just revised our strategic business plan that passed by members just a few months ago. And as part of that, we did consultations with all of the member bodies. It was open for participation. And I think when we talk about low-income countries, we sometimes think about it as a monolith, but the nuances from region to region is very different. So one of my colleagues from Zimbabwe, for example, was talking to me about the need for raising awareness about standards and about the ISO standard system and penetrating within universities and within academia and within students just because there's an awareness issue. And so that awareness needs to be addressed in order to get individuals to participate. We also heard comments about language barriers. So that's something that we've been tackling where we've got some of our communications materials are now going out in 5 languages, in Russian, Arabic, English, French, and Spanish, and we've got a Spanish translation task force. And then time zones was also an issue where the differences in time zones when we've got meetings, and we've started doing mirror meetings, so the same meeting to get consultation from member states, but we're doing it in 2 different time zones so that there is the opportunity for all countries to participate based on what their time zones are. And then finally, and I think ISO's done some great work here, is the finances. So when we've got in-person meetings, we're inherently going to end up with a lower engagement of from some individuals whose countries don't have budgets to send participants to those particular conferences. And I think ISO is doing a lot of good work here to be able to make funds available to ensure participation and capacity building. But I think those are key to being able to engage all voices and making sure that we've got all perspectives when we're talking about global issues.
Absolutely, really key point here. And I think for those of you online or in the room, if you are involved in climate solutions development and you've never engaged with your national standards body or with an international standards committee, make 2024 the year that you start, because actually we want to make sure that these voices are heard, but we can't do that if we don't have you in our committee. So do come up and talk to us after the event if you're interested in getting involved, or you can go to iso.org/members and you can find out who your national standards body is and how to get involved. Moving on to you, Violetta, as we mentioned earlier, I'm really keen for your perspective from the WTO on how can we get more policymakers and regulators involved in standards development to make sure that we are generating that regulatory alignment that so many are desperately calling for to support faster decarbonisation.
So this is a great question, and maybe just to echo that the WTO is not a standard-setting organization, but again, we do have an agreement, the Technical Barriers to Trade Agreement, that really encourages and fosters that international standards are set and that they help our members to set national regulations as much as possible in alignment to international standards. What some of you might not know is that the Technical Barriers to Trade Committee is actually one of the most popular committees at the WTO. It's one of the most functioning committees, and it's one of the committees that's one of most appreciated by our members. And that the reason is that it's become really a forum where our members, many of them who are governments, can really discuss technical barriers to trade. And what we hear from the renewable energy space, for example, is that they're less concerned about tariffs, but they're much more concerned about standards and regulations. And so I think when it comes to how to attract policymakers and regulators to pay attention to standards, it's really having the standard-setting bodies as well raise awareness of the type of work that you're doing. And this is where the WTO can help. We do have the committee, but we also have other forums like our public forum. We have, this year we have a trade house pavilion to support Trade Day, where we are trying to really elevate the importance of standards to the debate around climate action. And so this is, I think, to agree with you, Emily, a very important point for standards, because we are seeing that with an acceleration and I think a stock taking now that is calling on the global community to accelerate efforts for climate action, that standards have a very important role to play in supporting companies to accelerate, their efforts around decarbonization. And so just to, I think, call on, our international standard setting partners like ISO and others to keep working with us to raise that awareness. You count on us. We do see that many members from the WTO are increasingly paying attention to standards. And I think the reason is because they're facing a lot of push from their industry associations and companies that are saying, they're either concerned that there are too many voluntary, and private standards that are growing in high energy intensive sectors, or they're seeing some of the renewable energy companies that are trying to make a difference. And maybe everyone learned something at COP. I've learned a lot about this impossible, standards where renewable energy companies are maybe responding to markets that might already be stronger in place, or are trying to really, create market demand, and that's where standards can play a very big role. So I think just to echo, the WTO is here to really serve as that forum, and we encourage this type of dialogue.
That's fantastic. And I think on that point of dialogue, one of the really key insights that the research found is that to help ease that dialogue, help ease that passage of criteria set by these standards into policy and regulatory frameworks, for really ambitious concepts like net zero, we may need to trial new regulatory approaches to help businesses, policymakers, and others feel safe to embed this criteria that maybe has not hit the market at scale before. So I'm curious from each of the three of you before we go to questions, do you have any thoughts on what kind of new approaches or dialogues could be trialed to help criteria from international standards on net zero or deliverables like the ISO net zero guidelines get into policymaker conversations and regulatory conversations? Because Violetta, this must be something you see a lot in the WTO for the reasons you've said. So maybe if we start with you and then we can move down the panel back towards me and then we go to questions. So I'll pass straight back to you.
So I'll maybe share an example from our steel standards principles exercise. One of it was over a year ago that we learned that there were more than 20 different standards, again, voluntary standards primarily around decarbonization in the steel sector. And we had industry associations come to the WTO and say, can you help? We really see our companies that are really struggling to meet increased costs, to meet, they're sort of confused about different methodologies that are being set to measure carbon in steel products and technologies. And so what we also learned from that exercise was that many of the standard setting bodies were actually not aware of principles that the TBT committee set in the year 2000 around the development of international standards the development of international standards. And those principles are 6. A lot resonates also, I think, to the way that ISO has been working, which is really to promote transparency, openness, impartiality and consensus, effectiveness and relevance, coherence, and in the development dimension. And so for our members, I think what's become increasingly important is to really see that these TBT committee 6 principles for setting standards are recognized and that are applied as much as possible in the field of decarbonization. So they're still very relevant. And what we learned from the example of steel was that actually many of the standard setting bodies were not aware about these 6 principles. And one where they were really struggling was actually related to the development dimension, which is something that we really care about, because we see that many of our members are coming to the WTO, to our technical assistance program, to ask for increased training and capacity building around standards development and also around standards compliance. And so that's something that we see our members really care about. And it's great to hear of the examples that ISO is experiencing, not only in, when you're setting standards, what you're following in terms of including developing country voices, but when it comes to actually making sure that at a national level, national standard setting bodies, but also those that have to comply, whether it's small businesses or others, get the technical assistance and the capacity building that you need.
Brilliant, thank you. And Zach, to you next.
So I think there would be 3 categories that I would talk about. So the first is policymakers that have conventionally been in the space of regulation. That have the ability or have the authority, certainly, to be able to implement something like a net zero mandate. But the other 2, I think, are a little bit different than what we consider conventional regulators. And the first one is, I think there's some industry associations that bring together heavy emitters or sectors that we know need to decarbonize, like the transportation sector, that when you superimpose the requirement to actually do the planning for net zero, you actually end up taking a look at the sector and say, what does this look like from an economic standpoint and an investment standpoint? And then related to that is where's the money going to come from, which means I think that we don't often engage the treasury boards or the arms of governments that need to fund that transition. And I think that's a level of policy engagement that absolutely needs to happen, because what net zero guidelines does is it does force that capital planning, because you do hit limits on your grid stability where you need interties or where you need alternate solutions, or you do hit limits on your technology where you need innovation, and in that innovation needs capital investment. So I think that particular element of being able to engage the financiers that are going to be funding the transition is absolutely critical, and it often happens too late in the process.
Absolutely, thank you. And I think, again, some of the case studies published this week from the FIA, the global governing body of motorsport, which convenes all of these different global championships, is another great example of that point in action, that you can't have a standard that addresses this without building in these future decisions, the capital planning, and making sure that you're taking a holistic view of your net zero journey. And then finally to you, Masamba, from the UNFCCC's perspective, what kind of new approaches can be taken to help make policymakers and global institutions feel safe to trial and use this criteria from these impossible standards, as you call them, to really address these core needs like net zero?
For me, we have currently a very important opportunity to actually promote this impossible standard. This is linked to the outcome of the global stocktake. The outcome of the global stocktake will provide a gap, and this gap will need to be translated into needs in terms of climate and sustainability solution. And this is where I see a role important for this impossible standard. They need to define what are the type of solutions that are needed, but defining the solution based on what they will be used for. And this will provide clarity for the solution provider to develop the right solution and respond to this demand. And again, it's not only about technology. It will be technology, it will be finance, it will be policy, it will be business model, cultural and creative industry product, as well as innovative cooperative approach. All these things will be needed, and we need to combine them to respond to this demand that will come from the global stocktake. So to summarize, I think the global stocktake is a unique opportunity to make policymakers be aware that these impossible standards are absolutely needed for the transition to a green economy.
So you see actually these big moments of impetus that the UNFCCC can generate through the facilitation of summits like COP, the global stocktake, that can help put an additional spotlight and momentum towards policymakers and regulators to say, this is the moment you must urgently start to consider this more ambitious criteria. Otherwise, global stocktake after global stocktake will continue to show us that we're remaining off track. And that's something we do urgently need to rectify to meet, as you say, those core human needs.
Yeah, and it will focus on what is needed, not on the means. It will focus on what is needed, not on the means to get there. And for me, this is the most important thing, where I see the focus of the impossible standard.
Brilliant. So all of you are encouraged, as you can see on screen, to refer to the QR code where you can download this research on standards and transformative innovation. I promise it's much more fun a read than it sounds, genuinely. But I think it's really just helping to give that evidence base to your organizations internally to drive this new way of thinking. How can we reimagine the way we can set thresholds and use standards to help us rise up to meet what we already know is needed and help convince others to take that more ambitious route? So I'm really delighted to have all of you here. Thank you so much for this discussion. I am conscious of time, so we may need to wrap up, but for those of you who do have questions, please do come and chat to us after the session. And for those of you who don't but want to go away with some actions, the first key action to hit our inclusivity point is join your national climate standards committees, because again, we can't have that increased participation in these diverse outcomes without your involvement. www.iso.org/members to find your national standards committee, your national standards body, in your country who will connect you to your committee. To read our transformative innovation research and also some research that will be coming out in the new year on these interactions between standards, policy and regulation on net zero, to try and demystify some of these critical interactions that we need to understand that our panelists have spoken about. And finally, some things that you can read today and watch on the plane home if you wish. Download the ISO net zero guidelines that you have heard referred to in this session as your key tool to apply to any kind of organization for mapping out your entire end-to-end net zero journey in line with the UN Integrity Matters report on greenwashing. And you'll see some panels that were published this week from Reuters interviewing some of the case studies who have already been putting this into practice. Because again, this is not a theoretical concept. This is something we urgently need to do now, and transformative innovation is already in action. Thank you very much for joining us. And good afternoon from us in Dubai.